ambassador. Nevertheless, the rich collision here tonight as well is our amazing talent, because FIU, after all, is about our talent. Both current students, future amazing professionals helping drive these discussions. Our great alumni that will be joined by today and learn from today, that are doing very important work in this city. Amazing partner of the Green family, and Kimberly Green in particular, that is helping drive a lot of great dialogues and important future thinking at our Latin American and Caribbean Center, led by Jose Miguel Cruz, who's also with us tonight. So without further ado, to further prove that the way FIU rolls in DC for our students and our interns, we unleash them on a lot of key initiatives and projects at the university. Enter Sarah Correa, who last semester, she's now interning at the Wilson Center with our great friend Sandy Acosta. Unfortunately, could not be with us today. But last semester was interning here in our office and took upon the project of Cuba transition issues and U.S. government initiatives. So positioned her greatly to lead today's dialogue. So Sarah.
Well, welcome everybody. So I thought to start off, you would
hello everybody. So to start off, I thought our speakers should introduce themselves briefly. Should we sit? Bring everybody up here. So we have John Suarez from the Center Free Cuba. If you'd like to give a little bit of an introduction to our audience today.
Lifelong human rights activist, FIU alum, class of '92, and I can honestly say that FIU served as a formative experience. That's where I began my human rights activism as a student activist on campus, and opened up opportunities that brought me to where I am today.
And we have Andres Martinez Fernandez from the Heritage Foundation.
Hi, everyone. Andres. I am an analyst over at the Heritage Foundation, where I head up our Latin America portfolio, which is very active nowadays, as you might have heard. And alumnus of FIU, graduated in 2014, which is a great, very formative experience, and in a lot of ways, very directly responsible for the trajectory of my career. So glad to be here with all of you.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here with us. Thank you for coming out. So as you both mentioned, both of you are proud FIU alumni, now working at the center of major policy conversations in Washington. What sparked your interest in Latin America and the Caribbean? And how did FIU shape your path?
For me, I think there are a few things. Certainly I had personal connections to the region and the history. My family is mostly Cuban American with Puerto Rican American. I was born in Puerto Rico. On top of that, my father is a professor of Cuban history over at a rival university, University of Central Florida, which is there, all right. So I very much grew up with heightened awareness of the history of Latin America in general, and awareness of your kind of roots that you have, as many of you do. And then I will say FIU certainly had a lot to do with nurturing that and helping not only to build on my knowledge base and awareness of it, but also to find that kind of path forward to make it a professional focus and career, which is, I think, the kind of sweet spot that I'm sure many of you are looking for, as far as having this passion for a given subject area, whatever it may be, and then also finding a way to make money while doing that. And I with the help of FIU and some great friends, many of whom were in the great network of alumni that we have here in D.C. Was very much empowered to pursue that, and yeah, I've going on about 12 years. I've managed to stick around based on that.
Well, for me, it was I was at Florida International University. I was recruited while I was there by Morton Blackwell with an outfit called the Leadership Institute, and went to work as a youth coordinator, first in Nebraska, 2nd Congressional District, and then in '94, I returned to work for Terry Branstad, who was a governor running for re-election in Iowa. And on both occasions, I ran into representatives of the Cuban dictatorship. And being somebody from Miami was a bit of a shock. So Cuban diplomats in 1992 that were lobbying in the State House. And then in '94, lady who ran the Cuban Studies Institute out of New York, personal friend of Fidel Castro's, that was taking Midwesterners down to Havana. And I realized that there really wasn't at least in my perception, there wasn't a strong response in the English-speaking language growing up in Miami to counter that type of messaging. And that led to me wanting to get involved. And I came back down south and we set up something called the Free Cuba Foundation with students and alumni, and began a presence on the internet once the World Wide Web was up and running in the mid-'90s, and we took off from there. And I guess one of our highlights was in 1998, through networking that we had done, we ended up organizing with Italian counterparts a major conference in Rome the weekend prior to Pope John Paul II's visit to Cuba. And we were able to highlight the other voice of Cuba, that of dissident voices. And we had people like Carlos Alberto Montaner, Ricardo Bofill, who was one of the founders of the Cuban Committee for Human Rights, a prominent dissident group inside the island, along with many others, and was able to get a lot of attention internationally. And it sort of, from there, my decision came to be getting more involved in public policy. And eventually I wound up in Washington in 2000, where I met Frank Calzone, and as a program officer was involved with the Center of Free Cuba back then for a couple of years. Then I came back to Miami as in the Directorio Democrático Cubano, which had other FIU alumni involved. Was there for a number of years, and then I went on to Freedom House, which is one of the oldest human rights NGOs in the world, founded by Eleanor Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie during World War II in the fight against fascism. And I spent some very fruitful time at Freedom House, and then when Frank was retiring, he and other members of the board of the center approached me to take over as executive director, and I've been there since 2019.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you mentioned meeting the survivors of Cuban communism. Now my question is, what is the biggest misconception that Americans have about Cuba today? It's survivors, the people that currently live there, the regime.
Big misconceptions. One, that Cuba's not a threat, that Cuba hasn't carried out terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. The Cuban dictatorship, since the early 60s, initially tried in 1962 to organize a major terrorist attack that was foiled by the FBI, but then began working through proxy groups like the Macheteros and the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional, that between the 1970s and 1980s carried out 130 bombings in the northeastern United States. One of the more shocking incidences was at the Francis Tavern. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Francis Tavern. There's an important history to it. Back in 1783, it's where George Washington bade farewell to the troops at the end of the War of Independence. So this group decided to place a bomb at lunchtime, and this was on January 24th of 1975, killed 4 Americans, wounded 60 more, caused major structural damage at this historic site. The group had been financed, provided logistical support by Havana and training. The bomb maker, who was captured, tried and sentenced, broke out of prison, wound up in Mexico, had a shootout with Mexican police, and then wound up in Havana, where he is today, by the way, still harbored by the Cuban dictatorship. But they went on with their bombings for into the 1980s. The first evacuation of the Twin Towers was because of the macheteros. 100,000 people evacuated overall, but including the Twin Towers as well. And the regime, 1996, the Brothers to the Rescue shootout, which we recently saw Raul Castro indicted. That was, the murder of 3 U.S. citizens and a resident over international airspace. But we know now, decades before that they were also carrying out, through proxies, terrorist actions on U.S. soil, and people really don't know about that.
Yeah, I think I agree with all that. I'd say probably one that is somewhat common here in Washington is that the current Cuban regime is substantively different from the regime that was in place in the 1960s or at any period over history. Really, very little has changed, not only in the way the regime operates politically, which remains very much beholden to the Castro leadership, whether that's Raul Castro or some of these individuals. Yeah, it's worth noting that whenever you hear about these talks from the U.S., the counterpart is always a member of the Castro family, because they're the people who are always in the centers of power, whether it's the economy, the military, or elsewhere. And then on top of that, it's also as far as what hasn't changed is the threat that Cuba poses to not only the United States, but really globally. And even looking back to the actions, for example, Cuba sending soldiers to Africa to support revolutionary and aligned movements, you still see that today. It's happening in Ukraine. They're sending Cuban soldiers to support the Russian forces and their operations in Ukraine. And it's essentially the same modus operandi, that this is a regime, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in across Latin America with kind of subversive actions, or in the United States. It's a regime that has an underlying ideological mission, which is always going to make it an enemy of stability and democratic norms. And you see that at different levels over time. But I think you see that if you see that more constrained now, it's not because of the regime's own kind of change in its approach. It's more than anything, it's because it's been more constrained from the outside as far as its ability to engage in a lot of these actions. But at the end of the day, it's the same political system, the same economic system that hosted nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union, that took very direct actions to destabilize our hemisphere and undermine U.S. national security. And you see that, there's countless examples of that continuing today with whether it's espionage at the highest levels, the engaging in promoting violent social activism in the United States. All these things are things you can look back decades, and they were always in the playbook for the Cuban regime. And it's for a reason that those are still there. It's because the underlying regime really hasn't changed.
So do you think that dialogue is the right approach to the situation? Is it more sanctions, less sanctions? Like, what is the approach that you think would be ideal in this situation?
I think sanctions are absolutely necessary. You can have a dialogue, a critical dialogue, a dialogue based in reality. I think when, as my colleague here was just saying, for example, with the issue of Israel, Cuba sent troops masquerading as students through Europe to fight on the Syrian front against Israeli forces during the Yom Kippur War. Then, on the 50th anniversary in 2003, when Israel was attacked by Hamas, within hours of that attack, there was a pro-Hamas protest in Times Square. The organizer of that protest, Manolo de los Santos, of Dominican background, was a longtime agent of influence of Havana. He spent years working something called the Tricontinental, a publication that's based on a gathering that took place in Cuba in 1966, where guerrillas, terrorists, and extremist groups from around the world gathered together to coordinate efforts to undermine U.S. national security interest and Western democratic interests more broadly. So this isn't something that, as well said, the approach hasn't changed over the decades, and the players haven't. Raul Castro's here. Ramiro Valdez, who was the founder of the Cuban police state, is still active in Cuba today. He's a very elderly man, but he's still there in a position of power. When the Obama administration attempted to have a dialogue, Ben Rhodes, his counterpart that he met to discuss this with, was Raul Castro's son, Alejandro Castro Espín. And now the current administration is having a dialogue with the grandson, Raulito Castro, who when Miguel Díaz-Canel, who's the president, initially didn't know a dialogue was going on. What we heard on background was, well, he's not that important, and that's true. Who here has heard of Osvaldo Dorticos? Okay. Osvaldo Dorticos was president of Cuba from 1959 to 1976. But everybody knows that the real person running the show was Fidel Castro. And it's the same thing today. Miguel Díaz-Canel is president, but the person who's running the show, and when there's a crisis, appears, is Raul Castro. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The question, I think, has to be that what are we trying to achieve here? Is sanctions, if it's dislodging the regime, I think the question of whether sanctions are sufficient, I think there's real debate there. You know, one of the things that I have, there are a lot of people who say, well, you know, we're now launching this pressure campaign. We're, you know, actually enforcing the embargo and some of the trade restrictions that have always been nominally in place. Maybe that is sufficient to change the underlying situation. I think I have a lot of doubts about whether that kind of outside pressure, even economic and political, ramped up, is going to be sufficient to change and kind of dismantle a regime. I think the best example that we have here is, it's more accelerated timeline, but what we saw in Venezuela, which was very much what the U.S. was trying to do, was dislodge an entrenched regime using economic pressure, political pressure, and stoking kind of internal disunity within the regime, or exploiting that. And, you know, and that was the policy going. Obviously, we had a change in that policy under the Biden administration to a significant degree. But even after we kind of ramped that up to a very substantial degree in last year, in particular, when President Trump came to office, in the end, it was, you know, Delta Force that was the ultimate actor that removed and dislodged the regime, or at least how it existed before. So whether there's a lot of differences between Cuba and Venezuela, but I think it is important to note that this is a regime that has held on to power for going on 70 years, and everything that Nicolas Maduro and that regime learned as far as maintaining power, rooting out challenges that could arise internally, and maintaining a monopoly on force, came from the Cuban regime. And, you know, facing that reality, I think there's reason to have some doubts about whether this kind of external economic and political pressure alone could change and dislodge the regime. But it's certainly a different set of circumstances than we have seen in the past, as far as the global kind of alignment, regional alignment, and the level of pressure that the U.S. is bringing to bear. But that's, whether that goes to the question of effectiveness. I think the other kind of inherent question what you're asking is, well, what's an appropriate response to the Cuban regime, the Cuban threat, and there, I think, the two schools have been, or in Washington generally, some sort of accommodation and with a hope of curbing the excesses, whether on human rights or national security threats, or confrontation, you could say, which is either using these sanctions, other tools, or even military and clandestine. And I think we had an experiment with the kind of engagement, normalization, and accommodation approach with the Obama administration, which in the end really, I think it not only did it not bear fruit, substantial fruit, I think it showed that even with substantial concessions, the changes you make externally have a limited impact as far as changing the realities on the ground, as far as their economic stability, their political stability, and kind of exploiting maybe these kind of hardliner versus moderates dynamics in Cuba. And I think while you still, there's a question of, well, what are we going to dislodge the regime through this pressure tactic? I think it's not a certainty either way of whether, yes, this will eventually. But what I think is an important kind of factor to keep in mind is that you do, in either case, if you do take this approach of pressure, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, you do limit Cuba's ability to act as a malign force within the hemisphere and globally by bringing to bear that pressure. And I think you have seen that as a positive repercussion of that that pressure that the United States has at differing levels brought to bear in the case of Cuba, limiting their ability to seed new dictatorships in the Western Hemisphere as they have with Venezuela and elsewhere, and also to limit their ability to undermine U.S. national security. So that's how I approach it.
Do you think that their abilities to undermine our national security have been undermined because of our sanctions? I mean, there's still a lot of like espionage, as both of you brought up, going on. How do you see our sanctions limiting that?
Well, what I'd like to say first off is that the Obama administration wasn't the first time we saw an opening. That took place under the Carter administration. And what we've seen is time and time again that when you've tried to engage and give opportunities for them to improve their behavior through carrots, what's delivered is a lot of stick from the Cuban government against U.S. interest. During the Carter administration, you had the Mariel Exodus, which was seeded by violent criminals by Fidel Castro. His bodyguard in his book described how he personally, since he was embarrassed that so many people were disaffected, and Cubans were seen as a model exodus over the previous 21 years, that he then purposely targeted mental patients, rapists, murderers to seed in to create chaos in the U.S. He also, during this thaw, during the Carter administration, successfully overthrew Somoza and installed Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. There was also another human rights disaster. And then we see during the Clinton administration, the legitimization of the regime and also loosening of sanctions happens to coincide with the rise of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And when Delta Force went in, Delta Force wasn't in a firefight with Venezuelans. They were in a firefight with Cubans. 32 Cubans were killed fighting the U.S. forces protecting Nicolas Maduro. The Cubans have been torturing Venezuelan dissidents, and CASLA, which is a NGO based out of Prague, has documented extensively the role of Cubans in training Venezuelans in torture and also carrying out torture against Venezuelan dissidents in Venezuela. So On the topic of espionage, the Cubans have successfully penetrated in the United States every level. One of the first CIA agents to flip, Phil Agee, he tried to go to the Russians weren't sure about him, so he went to the Cubans received him, and he provided a lot of information, got a lot of agents exposed and killed. We had Ana Belén Montes, who was she was at the Pentagon Defense Intelligence Agency for 17 years. She was one of the people tasked with performing the report on the threat assessment that Cuba posed to the United States. Irony, Fidel Castro actually came out and said of the report, there was a serious report done by serious people, talking about his own spy. We had Manuel Rocha, ambassador to Bolivia. He had been at the NSC. He had been at the interest section in Cuba during the Brothers to the Rescue shootdown. 40 years spying for the Cuban government. And there are so many others. Well, William Kendall Myers and his wife at the State Department, a very high-level person who trained many State Department officials, also a long-term asset of the Cuban dictatorship. So this is a regime that, in addition to being a sponsor of terrorism, allied with others hostile to the United States, like the Soviet Union, China. There are currently Chinese bases in Cuba, eavesdropping on everything going on here in the U.S. And, as you already mentioned, there are thousands of Cubans fighting for Mr. Putin in Ukraine, including Black WASP, Vispas Negras, which are Cuban special forces fighting today in Ukraine for Mr. Putin in an imperial war. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is basically, would they be doing more of this kind of malign activity with more resources? And I think just everything that we know and have seen from this regime points inevitably to the answer, yes, they would. Because at the end of the day, again, going back to what I was saying, I think they have an ideological imperative behind their regime, which puts it at odds with the order, the Western order, and in this hemisphere, in particular, the U.S. Kind of influence and security sphere being asserted. So I think they would undoubtedly be utilizing more of those resources towards that mission if they could. And I mean, the fact that they're doing it in this moment, while they have massive economic crises and instability and poverty and a lack of any kind of basic stability, is a testament to their willingness to prioritize their ideological struggle.
Do you think that this is also minimizing Chinese and Russian intelligence in Cuba?
So I think you could argue that certainly that the U.S. economic pressure that's being brought to bear. So I'll give an example. With China, and there was some reporting on this maybe a year or two ago about how a series of Chinese businesses and investors who following this kind of political imperative to engage in the Cuban economy. After a period, came away with limited, essentially exasperated by the Cuban system, seeing no opportunities and no viable path for substantial investment of the kind that China, while it has a substantial political motive behind it, there is also, in most cases, some kind of economic motivation that's underlying it. And even with all of that in mind, in Cuba, there was very little that they reportedly saw as an opportunity. And I think to a significant degree, that is in part because of the U.S. Maintaining substantial restrictions on the Cuban economic system and trade with the U.S. through the embargo. A lot of it also has to do with just the failures of the Cuban system inherent in that economic system. But when you look at other pseudo-communist or deeply problematic underlying systems where China has made substantial investments, including in Venezuela, but also elsewhere in Africa. They have still managed to make those investments and build up a lot more of a strategic influence and presence than they have necessarily in Cuba. And I think that's in part because the Cuban system just doesn't offer those, thanks in part to the pressure that the United States continues to maintain there.
I agree with what he just said. I think it's also because Cuba hasn't, in the case of China, Vietnam, Russia, they reformed their agricultural space to allow farmers to sell directly in markets. And in the case of Cuba, Cuba has maintained a centralized communist model. So farmers who try to sell their crops directly to other Cubans are in prison today. So what Cuba is doing is it's importing, Havana, the regime, is importing 80% of its food. Most of it purchases from the United States, by the way. Last year, they broke a new record, $800 million in products purchased by the Cuban government from U.S. companies. Most of it chicken and vegetables and other items used for food inside of the island because they don't allow the farmers to produce it.
Well, I guess moving on to Venezuela, but keeping the Russia and China focus, with the growing involvement from those two countries and Iran now, how has the geopolitical dimension changed Washington's approach to Venezuela?
Well, I think also the mistake is to leave Cuba out of the equation. Cuba was the entree point for China, Iran, and Russia. The Cubans, if we go back to 1960, the first delegation that visits Mao after the revolution was led by Che Guevara. And they sat down and planned out what were the areas of opportunity to target in the Western Hemisphere throughout Latin America. The Cuban intelligence services have been operating not only in the United States, but throughout Latin America, looking for weak points, penetrating academia, the political system, the diplomatic system, and they've had great successes. And one of the things that they've done is they've been able, and we heard about this with the case of Anibal and Montes, they sell their intelligence to Russia, to China, and others that they gather. So it's a mistake to underestimate the strength of the Cuban system of intelligence, which was trained in part by the KGB, by the East German Stasi, and by the Czech STB system. So they're key players in Venezuela. It wasn't Russians or Chinese defending Nicolas Maduro. It was Cubans.
Yeah, I would say also, I think the kind of global dynamics with respect to a potential U.S. conflict with China, for example, which I think the general consensus is that we're approaching a window of a few years of maximum kind of threats of that materializing in part through an effort of China to take militarily Taiwan, and so in that context, but also just the broader, increasingly strategic and military competition between the United States and China, I think that the presence that China has in the Western Hemisphere, including very much Cuba, but also elsewhere, has a new dimension of concern and poses a new vulnerability for the United States, which maybe wasn't present or wouldn't be present outside of that potential. And so I think when you hear the concerns about this presence in Panama for the Chinese around the Panama Canal, or these major ports, the strategic intelligence base in Cuba and elsewhere, Peru certainly, but all of this has, beyond just this outside extrahemispheric actor being in our hemisphere and challenging maybe U.S. influence dynamics. It also brings a new dynamic of, well, what does all this mean as far as a potential conflict between the U.S. and China? And, you know, when we look at the presence at the port, at the Panama Canal, for example, well, you can disrupt a major artery of U.S. trade and also the ability to move warships across from the Atlantic to Pacific. You see also when it comes to the presence of these intelligence bases in Cuba and elsewhere in the Caribbean, that basically just about any movement of substance, of assets from and around, in and around Florida is instantly on the radar of China and other actors. All sorts of and there are all sorts of potentials as far as using infrastructure for militarily, and I think that's something that is really changing the perception of Washington in general, not even just for this administration. I think there's a lot more concern about what that presence is, in part because when you look at that presence, it's the only kind of logical thread you see behind, massive investments in tiny Caribbean islands or in infrastructure around critical trade routes is that it's all linked to vital arteries and vulnerabilities of the United States from within our hemisphere. So.
Wow. So kind of moving beyond this crisis situation, the headlines surrounding this situation, where do you see meaningful opportunities for growth, innovation, partnership in Venezuela? Either of you can go first.
Well, I think in the case of Venezuela, there's a very strong civil society. Maria Corina Machado, the ability that they had in a rigged election to demonstrate that it was rigged, to demonstrate that a absolute majority, supermajority of Venezuelans wanted change. And there's still that democratic movement inside and outside of the island pushing first for the release of all political prisoners. Many have been released, but many still remain behind bars. And there is that desire for a democratic change. So what I believe is that backing the Democrats is the way to achieve the necessary change to be able to have engagement. Why? To be able to have sound economic engagement necessitates the rule of law. And to have the rule of law, you need democracy.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities, and obviously there are people who would like to see the transition accelerate in Venezuela. But I think when you look on the whole, and as far as the trajectory that we're seeing, and the more recent news is that there's the U.S. supporting through intelligence strikes on different narco-terrorist targets in Venezuela, including in the mining region, which has been just dominated by narco-terrorists and illegal mining organizations, which have caused not only great human suffering but environmental damage. That's something that a few years ago, or even a year ago, wouldn't be envisioned as a possibility. And you're seeing that at the same time as you see continued engagement from the U.S., not only around the economic front, but around the political sphere, including the shutting down of torture facilities and other key avenues. I think you'll see that continue, particularly in the political sphere, as we see this initial stability that the administration laid out as a initial priority. I think it's important just to keep in context, particularly the context of what we have seen over the past several years, the trajectory that we're seeing. And if you do that, it's a substantial, if not necessarily fully satisfying, rate of change.
So kind of growing on this growth question, if you were advising the next U.S. administration, what would be the top priorities for strengthening relationships in the region over the next decade? Specifically Venezuela and Cuba.
Well, I'll answer not specifically first on Venezuela and Cuba. I think one of the most important transformations that we're seeing right now is across Latin America with this new wave of leaders coming to power in election after election that are overwhelmingly aligned with the United States and not only on an ideological front, but also as far as the priorities of ensuring the security and stability of our hemisphere against these narco-terrorist threats. And I think that is an opportunity that we haven't seen really, I think, compared to even in the past where we had more conservative moments in the region and leaders, even compared to that, this is a much more aligned set of leaders when you compare it to, for example, Jose Antonio Cast in Chile against Sebastián Piñera in Chile. Just a lot more alignment broadly, and that's a huge opportunity for the United States to maintain a attention and engagement with the Western Hemisphere, which is prioritized and at the end of the day is in the interest of the United States and the American people, and that can be a whole other discussion of how it's in the interest, but it's I think seeing the consequences of U.S. disengagement in our hemisphere, which has been kind of the dominating policy for a couple decades at least. The consequences of that, as far as instability for the region, 100,000 dead Americans every year because of fentanyl, 200,000+ migrants arriving at the U.S. border with Mexico, and this creeping Chinese presence around strategic sites in our hemisphere. All this is a consequence of that disengagement. So I think I would certainly hope that the next administration, Republican or Democrat, would recognize the disastrous consequences of that disengagement and attention, and seize on the opportunity to work with this slew of new elected leaders in our hemisphere, which vocally and explicitly wants to work with the United States.
Well, I think also requires clarity in places like Mexico and Colombia, where you have Claudia Sheinbaum, former M19 terrorist or affiliated with, and you had Gustavo Petro, who was also M19, terrorist group, financed, backed by Havana. But I think in terms, to get to your question about Venezuela and Cuba, again, I think that the priority has to be the freeing of political prisoners, solidarity and support for civil society, for the Democrats. I mean, it's important to remember, in the case of Cuba, you had 30,000 Cubans sign something called the Varela Project, a petition for a democratic opening in Cuba. The organizers of this petition, which was legal in Cuban law, many of them were sentenced to 18, 20 years in prison, and the leader of that initiative, Osvaldo Paya Sardinas, was murdered in 2012. It's not a coincidence that murder, that extrajudicial killing, took place during the Obama thaw. So what we've seen is not only is it worse externally for U.S. interest abroad, but this engagement approach with the dictatorship, when it's unprincipled, leads to worse outcomes for Cuban dissidents and for the Cuban people internally. So I think if we want to have a better relationship with Cuba, and Cuba's not the dictatorship, it's the Cuban people, it needs to be solidarity with the political prisoners, with the Cuban people overall. I think one of the positive things we've seen with this administration, in addition to targeting the regime elite, Gaesa, the relatives of the dictatorship who are living in South Florida, Europe, and other places, is that at the same time, they've managed to pressure the Cuban government, use their leverage to encourage direct humanitarian assistance reaching Cubans on the ground that have been suffering. There was a major hurricane last October, Hurricane Melissa, hit the eastern side of the island. The Canadians and the Europeans sent millions in aid and assistance. The people on the ground didn't see it or feel it. The United States, January and February, sent their millions in aid. People felt it. We got feedback about this assistance getting in. It was just announced, I think, today or yesterday, that more of that assistance is getting to the people in need on the ground through independent channels. We need more of that to improve relations with Cuba. And I think in the case of Venezuela, where things have progressed and there's more opportunities, again, pushing forward for an authentic democratic transition. I don't think that Delcy and her brother are trustworthy, nor Diosdado Cabello. They're hardcore communist, second, third generation. Delcy's father kidnapped a U.S. executive, held him in the jungle for 3 years, died under interrogation by Venezuelan forces. So she's someone that is very hardcore and is not sympathetic with the pre-existing system and is very tight with the Cubans.
All roads lead to Havana. So looking ahead, since we're talking about, improving relations and, advising, what do you recommend students to kind of prioritize in their own education or professional skills when it comes to developing, this part of the world?
I think there are a lot of answers there, but for me, what I found incredibly useful and important is to have an understanding of economic issues of substance, and in particular when it comes to topics of related to private sector investment. That's one of the things that for me has been really crucial in my career. I came to DC first for I was actually a heritage intern. And then after that, I moved back and forth. But one of the more substantive periods of my career was working in a macroeconomic political risk consulting sphere. And even outside of that, the policy issues when it comes to U.S. Latin America, there's a lot of security there, but the economic linkages and investments, trading relationships, the concerns, for example, of investors in the private sector in the U.S., whether you're looking at what's happening now in Venezuela, for example, with oil companies, or the issues of supply chains that the U.S. is trying to entice out of China and into the U.S. and the Western Hemisphere. I think all of this really requires a solid base of understanding of underlying economic issues and including in there some business dynamics as well. So I would encourage definitely anyone interested in working in Latin America issues and policy issues even to spend some time acquiring that knowledge through courses and also through work experience. And I think that's also an important. I think there are a lot of opportunities not only now in that sphere, working as I did in a macroeconomic consulting firm, but I think as we see these kind of policy initiatives from Washington continue to focus on the Western Hemisphere, I think a lot of future opportunities are going to stem from that business and economic side of the policy and investment world. So.
I think one of the biggest mistakes that the United States and Western democracies made back in the day was the belief that through economic development, China would become a democracy. Instead, what we saw was a regime that killed 45 million of its own people, empowered, is just a bad actor on a global stage, which has undermined international human rights standards over the past generation. So I think what we need to be looking at is values, human rights, not providing subsidies to bad actors and to dictatorships, because when you do that, what you're getting is more bad outcomes. It's like if you're, in the case of China, the billions that were invested are now coming back with ICBMs, with spy bases, with efforts to undermine democracy around the world, and that didn't need to happen.
Yeah, thank you. So while we're on this topic, I'd like to open the floor to some questions from students and members.
Hold on. Okay.
Hi, my name is Ariana Aragon. I'm an international relations student at FIU with a minor in economics, and my interest is in economic development in Latin America. My question, I'm also Cuban and Peruvian, born and raised in Miami from my parents' side. So my question is specifically about the Cuban infrastructure in terms of voting and how we would ensure like fair democratic elections. In Venezuela, there is an infrastructure there for that. In Cuba, because of how the systems are set up, that's almost impossible to achieve. So I'm curious what your recommendations would be in how to set up fair elections in Cuba.
It's not impossible to achieve. You just need to get democratic actors abroad to help provide that infrastructure and set it up. In the case of Venezuela, it's that the opposition, despite that infrastructure being rigged, they were prepared after having had numerous elections stolen to be able to document and observe what was taking place on the ground and then rebut the official narrative of the regime and expose it and get the international community to recognize what had actually happened. So I think the Cubans can study what took place in Venezuela, hopefully in a situation where you don't have not only Maduro's people, but the Cubans also assisting them in rigging this process. So hopefully it won't be as challenging a change, assuming that there's already been a change of regime or an opening, a political opening where you can have free and fair elections. Then setting up the architecture of it, I think, is relatively easy.
Yeah, John knows a lot more about this angle than I do, but certainly the role of the international community, the United States, and to that end, a lot of these regional actors and countries that are very much more aligned with the United States, I think are going to be really important as far as ensuring some level of stability for elections and bringing to bear technical knowledge that is necessary to realize elections there in a future scenario.
Oh, and I just want to add, I speak not from a Cuban expertise, but I was actually an election observer in the first and third rounds of parliamentary elections in Egypt following the revolution in Tahrir Square. So that's where I'm coming from with that information.
Hi, my name is Marcus Abraham. I'm a graduate student focusing on the political development of the Caribbean itself. With the advent of Venezuela, we've seen increased cooperation between the United States and, for example, Trinidad, where I'm from, and how that has played a key role. And as you mentioned just now, there's a need for collaboration between, countries within the region, in essence, and countries that surround these situations that the United States would like to address. When it comes to that interaction, what exactly would you say is the approach? What exactly would you say, or for example, how would you speak about this approach or the future of the interaction? Because for me, in general, the interactions with the Caribbean and the wider world is something that is usually consequential and not necessarily as critical, but as we've seen now, it's becoming more critical.
I think that in the cases of places like Trinidad and Tobago that has a history of free and democratic elections, there can be some great input for Cuban Democrats to get your know-how and assistance to be able to have a free and fair election in Cuba and set up the structures that are able to accomplish that. So definitely, democratic neighbors can definitely assist quite a bit in that.
Hi, my name is Frank Alson. I'm a retired political scientist. I spent some time at Freedom House and the Center for Free Cuba. And I have a couple of questions. Try to be very brief. One, sometimes we hear about Cuban soldiers. I think the panelists could tell us about the Cuban armies. How large were they in Angola, in the Horn of Africa? Were there tanks in the Golan Heights? These are not just a handful of people. There are tanks, there are airplanes. It's a major effort. That's one thing. Maybe some clarification. The other thing is, we often hear the Cuban government's been there for 60 years. Long time. What has changed? Is the Cuba of today the same of 50 years ago, or 40 years ago, 20 years ago? What has changed? What's the situation of the Cuban church? What's the situation of the opposition? What's the situation of the European Union in regard to Cuba? What's the situation of Honduras, of Chile, of Argentina, of Ecuador? Ecuador, I think they kicked the Cuban ambassador. He started burning the papers. So anyway, those are the things. And basically, what about the Cuban people? What do they want? What do the Cubans in Cuba say? That's enough. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think as far as the Cuban military presence globally, as we mentioned, that remains a very active priority and mission for this regime, whether it's deploying within Latin America or very actively now with Ukraine and that conflict. I think that, going back to what we're talking about, the resource question and restrictions kind of limiting that activity, that is one of the spheres where I think the Cuban government, a Cuban government which would be better resourced, would be deploying more of those to its military, including abroad, through cooperation with actors like Russia and other malign forces. So I think that's another example of how this kind of approach from the U.S. is helpful in limiting that activity. But it's still substantial, and even with those resource limitations, and it's one of the major ways in which Cuba continues to exercise a malign influence beyond its border and present a national security threat for really the West in general.
And I just want to, you asked about Africa. A lot of folks talk about the Cuban role in Angola. There were, over the course of the conflict, hundreds of thousands of troops involved. But another area, which I think is a much darker chapter, is the Cuban role in Ethiopia with Haile Mariam Mengistu, where the Cubans, along with Russian troops, were involved in a genocide there, helping to fabricate a famine, starve out farmers in the countryside that weren't sympathetic with the regime. They were poisoning water wells, they were murdering cattle, in addition to carrying out a Red Terror in which a number of young people were killed. So that's part of the history that I think needs to be known. Another case, and this is in the Naval Press in their book Honor Bound, there's a chapter called The Cuban Zoo, and the Cubans were invited by the North Vietnamese to torture U.S. POWs during the Vietnam War. And that's well documented. John McCain came out and condemned it back a few years ago. So Cuba's really been punching above its weight internationally in a very nefarious way for a long time.
Yeah, hi. I'm Jose Miguel Cruz. I'm the director of the KG LAC. And now, I have a question for you. What needs, in these circumstances, what needs to happen really to produce change in Cuba? Because I've been hearing that, for many years now, that finally, the moment may be close. But I live in Miami. I'm not Cuban, but I'm surrounded by Cubans in Miami, and surrounded by Cubans who have happened to just came from Cuba. and have this conversation with them. And when they describe the conditions in which their family, they themselves, their families, they have been living like that, not for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, for years, right? For years. And I asked myself, but why this hasn't prompted a change already? So why we should believe that this is going to happen now if the conditions that they're describing, for me, it's like, this should have, whatever change may happen should have happened, years ago because of the condition that people are, right? So help me understand what do you think needs to happen now that will produce change?
The precarious situation that Cubans have suffered for decades is not a bug, but a feature of the system. When Fidel Castro took power, Cuba was able to produce enough food to feed itself. He set up a rationing system because I think the idea was, rather than having Cubans conspiring for democratic change, Cubans never wanted communism. Fidel Castro came to power in 1959, promising the restoration of democracy, and then imposed an even more extreme dictatorship on a populace that wanted to be free. So instead of that, they're trying to figure out how they're going to have breakfast, how they're going to have lunch, how they're going to have dinner. What's different this time is that you have the regime elites, the ones that are normally partying in Madrid, in Miami, and other places, especially the ones who are partying in Miami, being stripped of their visas, sent back home, their bank accounts frozen, Gaesa exposed. Back in last year, Nora Torres with the Miami Herald exposed that the Cuban regime was sitting on $18 billion in cash reserves while pleading poverty. The paradox is currently the main supporter of the Cuban regime financially is Europe. Spain has spent billions of dollars propping up that regime. Why? Because they believe the rhetoric and the victim narrative pushed by Havana. The problem is that narrative is breaking down. And the Cubans inside the island have known that for a while. That's why we've seen these mass protests break out. It's going to be 5 years now from the 11J protest. The regime cracked down brutally. There are over 1,200, there's 1,281 identified political prisoners currently. There are thousands more in prison under the potential that they could be a problem in the future. And that's a 4-year prison sentence just for you possibly being a dissident. Despite that, Cubans are still out in the streets protesting, and the situation of the regime elite, if we look at communism in the Soviet Union and China, the first generation is the one that's very hardcore and is willing to do whatever it has to do to maintain power. That generation is finally passing from the scene. So that's where I think people think when Raul Castro goes, and Ramiro Valdez, the founder of the police state, and with this tightening of a vice over the regime elite, that could create fissures. Back in 2021, when the orders were given to shoot Cubans, some of them carried out those orders. But other generals, some retired, some active, mysteriously died of COVID in large numbers in a small period of time. So there are problems within that regime elite. And I think as we see this change, generational change, that'll create another further opportunity for change.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that what you're referring to is kind of the reality of Cubans on the ground, right? And I don't think that is what the U.S. sanctions policy is aimed at affecting. It's aimed at affecting the primary beneficiary of economic flows, whether it's from Europe or from including the United States, which has always been the regime itself. And by reducing the resources to the regime, the argument would be that you are creating the conditions wherein the regime is no longer able to maintain its internal stability and cohesion and exercise that over the population. As I said earlier, I think it's still a question of whether that will change, lead to the ultimate collapse of the regime. But I do think that the argument and kind of the thinking of the policy is separate from, it's not that we're gonna make the conditions for Cubans marginally more difficult. It's that we're going to dry up the flows of resources to the regime itself, which, as I said, has always benefited primarily from those.
A second question, to follow up on some of the things that were mentioned before. How would you balance with the foreign desires for Cuba and the views of Cuba with the voices of the people within Cuba? How do we work towards, let's say that the regime does fall, how do we work towards hearing the voices of the people of Cuba without projecting what we think is best for them?
I think when you had over 30,000 Cubans in this Barella Project initiative, which was started inside of the country by Cubans, calling for a democratic opening, one of the perverse things is Fidel Castro tries to claim that human rights is something alien to the Cuban experience. It's completely the contrary. If we go back to the 1940s, at the end of World War II, it was the Cuban delegation that actually first went to Winston Churchill and then Eleanor Roosevelt proposing a universal declaration of human rights. The first draft was written by a Cuban diplomat. So the Cubans have had a profound understanding of human rights that goes back to Jose Marti and the wars of Cuban independence from the 19th century. So I believe that tradition, frustrated by 67 years of communist dictatorship, is still there, and you hear it with the Cubans. I mean, the 5-year anniversary of this uprising in July, they were chanting for freedom in the streets. The example of the Christian Liberation Movement and Osvaldo Payá has been one of advocating for a restoration of human rights of this older Cuban tradition. And we're seeing it in the protests taking place across the island even today. So that's how I would answer that. I'd say listen to them and respect their choices in a free and fair democratic vote.
Yeah, I think that ultimately, what myself and John and others are pushing for isn't to impose a U.S. Leader in Cuba. It's to restore its democratic norms, which it once enjoyed. Although it's been certainly anyway. So that ultimately, I think that is how we are going to see the will of the Cuban people respected, and absent that, you see the will of this Castro regime, which has imposed its own will on the Cuban people, and I think for too long here in Washington and elsewhere, we've conflated that, which the regime, in which the regime kind of sets the international view of what the will of the Cuban people is, but the two are very, very much at odds. And I think by removing that regime and restoring democratic elections and norms, you ultimately do the most beneficial thing that you can for Cuban voices.
Last question.
Hi. Sorry. I'm Dylan. I attend Bates College, actually, in Maine. I'm currently interning in the House of Representatives for my local congressman in New Jersey's 8th District. And I guess one of my questions right now is, I think that you answered part of it just now, but how is enabling democracy abroad a viable solution when it's coming from a nation that's facing a lot of questions about democracy in its own system? I feel like from what I've seen, checks and balances in the U.S. In my time following politics has been eroding through this current administration. And when I think through American history and when America's tried to uphold democracy abroad, it often leads to the exertion of America's will over other countries, and that often doesn't go great. And so my question is, like, what steps can our country take to, make it so that democracy is implemented in a collaborative way rather than it being one of, like, this is what you have to do. These are the policies we are putting into place. So, like, to actually dissolve that us-them binary and actually create collaborative change that lasts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a more positive view of our kind of efforts at promoting democratic norms historically, although it's been imperfect, certainly. I think when you talk about the restoration of elections and democratic freedoms, basic democratic freedoms, which is I think at the core of what we'd like to see, and I think the administration would say this. That is something that, again, that's not imposing a U.S. a set of policies, right? It's just creating a framework through which countless nations and across the Western Hemisphere, across Europe, and have expressed the will of the people and maintained a level of democratic stability and norms that has ultimately brought about far more human prosperity and stability than has the alternate system, which you see now in Cuba and elsewhere. So I think ultimately it's just a system that that in the end of the day is the best guarantor for human prosperity and human rights, and seeing that realized, I don't think is imposing an agenda of U.S. interests necessarily.
There are no perfect democracies. There are always challenges. The U.S. has a long history with its light and dark periods. However, if we go by that standard that, well, the U.S. is imperfect, therefore we can't confront evil. Think about this. 1941, Jim Crow South, lynchings, the Klan. Race laws more extreme than that of Nazi Germany. Is that a reason not to resist the Nazis? No. Was the U.S. efforts after the end of World War II in restoring democracy in Germany a failure because of its shortcomings at home? I think not. So the policies that are implemented, I think the case would be the majority, the minority, Republicans, Democrats, need to come together and look out, and I think that's where the debate needs to be, at how do you empower the Cuban people to be able to be the protagonist in a democratic transition and sustaining a new democratic system. Because if that's achieved, there are great things. One, democracy restored in Cuba. There won't be a reason for the large outflows of Cubans, which paradoxically, if we go through the last 67 years, the outflows haven't been during Republican administrations. They've been during Democratic administrations when they've been outreach into the dictatorship. So the Cuban people have voted with their feet with despair when Democrats have sought mistakenly that the dictatorship represents Cuba and that they engage with that dictatorship. The Cubans then feel hopeless, and that's one of the factors. Also, the other factor is the regime feels there are no consequences to weaponizing migration, and that's why they did it in the 60s, in the 80s under Mr. Carter, under Mr. Obama. There was a flow through Central America. There was another flow. The biggest one was with President Biden. Over 2 million Cubans came into the United States. Why? Because after the debacle of Afghanistan, Cuba literally, within a few weeks' time, opened up a visa-free channel between Havana and Managua, and you had this mass exodus out of the island, which coincidentally stopped when Mr. Trump came into office, as it stopped previously when Trump came into office the first time after the Obama administration. So there really is, you do see the consequences of a policy that doesn't sanction the regime and hold it to account, it's not good for the Cubans in the country, and it's not good for the region, and it's not good for the United States.
Thank you all for your questions, and thank you for the both of you coming out tonight. To finish up, we have one last question. What is one book, podcast, newsletter, or news source that you would recommend to students looking to better understand Latin America and the Caribbean?
You know, it's hard to recommend as far as current news and staying up to date. It's hard to recommend focusing on one because I think you get different levels of either bias or incomplete information from different outlets. So I would encourage kind of a broad swath of sources and resources when it comes to that. Beyond that, I think it's helpful it's underappreciated how informative history can be for people analyzing contemporary political issues. So I encourage you guys to go back into, there's a lot of great, I just picked up a book on biography of William McKinley, who's interesting, particularly for this moment, and I'll let you guys read more about him. Very little known president, or underappreciated president. And when you look at a lot of what we've seen in the past, including right now with respect to Cuba, you can get much better informed in your analysis currently by being well informed about the past interactions and history there. So,
Well, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to give you 3 books. One, and this is a fundamental book to understand how to resist dictatorship and democratic backsliding, and it's a book called The Power of the Powerless by Václav Havel, a Czech dissident who became president, also presided over a velvet divorce between Czechoslovakia becoming the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, and then becoming president of the Czech Republic, and then leaving office and having a great post-career as a human rights defender. With Cuba, there are 2 books I'd recommend reading. One by a Cuban statesman, now a little over 90 years old, Nestor Carbonell, Why Cuba Matters. And the final book I'd recommend, which goes into history, and it's a thick monster of a book, but it's by Lord Hugh Thomas, Cuba or the Pursuit of Freedom. And I think with those 3, you'd really understand what the situation in Cuba and what the potential solutions are. Thank you.
I'm not sure if you saw, but there was a fury of pens writing down those book names over here. Well, thank you both so much for coming out tonight and sharing these insights and all this information with us. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.